We just came through the Advent season, and I don't know how high church your church is and whether you celebrate technically Advent or you just do Christmas stuff around Christmas time. Technically, this was something that developed in the history of the church, that the first Sunday of Advent is always the Sunday closest to November the 30th. And therefore, some years it's in November and some years it's in December. This year it was in December, so you have 4 weeks that lead up to it. There are usually themes that are attached to the celebration of Advent, such as hope and peace and joy and love. Those are the typical ones. Sometimes you'll see the order of those moved around in church history, but for the most part, that's kind of the history. Not anything in the Bible, but it's something that developed in ecclesiastical history, and it kind of can be engaging and good for the people. So maybe that wouldn't work. We are kind of an autonomous, independent type of church group of people, and I don't know that we want to get in the muck and the mire of too many church traditions, but sometimes some rootedness helps. We've just gone to 2 services at the church where I preach, and we sing very traditional music. It's kind of wild, really. It is. You'd come to visit our church, you'd be in a time warp. And anyway, what is interesting is some of our younger people, we have very few of those. The average age of our church is 142. But anyway, if some of the younger ones will say, why don't we start a liturgical service? They're more interested actually in kind of rootedness from way back in the ancient church. So we're thinking about that a little bit. And the kind of thinking was, why does every church in Joplin of the Christian church stripe have to be the same? Maybe we can offer an alternative. So that might be one way to go, one way to think about it. But anyway, just to give you a little bit of an intro to this, I've been at the congregation now, and I still do teach part-time at the college, but been at the church there for about 3 years. So that means 3 Advent seasons, 3 Christmases. The first year, I stole a title from my son, who's up in Indianapolis at the Chapel Rock Church, my oldest boy, Casey. He did a series called Meet the Davidson Family. You with me? The very first verse of your New Testament, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so meet the Davidson family. So we did a series out of Matthew 1 and 2 on who's in the Davidson family. Of course, you get to deal with the genealogy and things like that. And then last year, we did the songs in Luke, because everybody's singing in the first few chapters of Luke. Elizabeth sings, Simeon sings, Mary sings, Zechariah sings. They all have their songs. Fred Craddock used to say, when we exegete the Gospel of Luke, we don't just exegete it, we just hum through the first 2 chapters, because everybody's singing. Then this year, because I was doing this theme I mentioned earlier, undivided, since 23 is a prime number, can't be divided, so I just said undivided in the Testaments. That was the Christmas series. So I matched up Old Testament prophecies with New Testament fulfillments. And that's fun to do. A virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son. And so it didn't have to just be minor prophets, but that was the series this year, which is sort of the impetus. So if I could back you up a little bit into December, that's what this lesson will be about today. Just the Christmas gospel nuggets. As I mentioned earlier, the 12, the minor prophets, play a significant role in specifically the birth narratives and, of course, also the passion narratives as well. But specifically, Micah and Hosea sort of take center stage when it comes at least to the birth narratives. Some of their prophecies were literally fulfilled, and some of them were, to use my teacher at Denver Seminary, Craig Bomberg's name, he would say they're typologically fulfilled. You remember about typology. Typology is a person, thing, or event that prophetically prefigures something that will come later. Now, you can have typology in the Old Testament that's fulfilled in the Old Testament. And we keep using the Old Testament and New Testament as labels. I don't know that that's the best. Maybe we should say Hebrew Bible and Greek Bible. But anyway, so how they're fulfilled is kind of an interesting thing. And therefore, I want to do some hermeneutical work up front here to kind of set the stage for a few things we'll say from both the book of Micah and the book of Hosea. So let me come to that here on your outlines, a little bit of just some hermeneutical exercise. How do New Testament writers use Old Testament texts? How did the Greek New Testament writers use the Hebrew Bible? Well, the answer to that is in several ways. But let me just give you these things. This is not all. There'd be a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. But here will be some things to keep in mind. A very small percentage of what we think of as prophecy is predictive. Are you all with me? Prophecy, again, is this inspired spokesperson giving the message of God to God's people. The literal word prophetes, by the way, that Greek word occupies 81 pages of small print in Gerhard Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. 81 pages just on that one word, prophetes. It means to speak before. Notice the prefix, P-R-O, to speak before. So it could be to speak before God's people, or it could be to speak before the thing happens. We call that predictive prophecy. But actually, a very small percentage of the minor prophets and the major prophets is actually predictive. So when it does happen, we better pay attention, because it doesn't happen very much. And sometimes it happens with what's called near-far fulfillment or prophetic perspective. It can mean something to the people then, and it can mean something even greater later. So we got to kind of watch that shift. So that's the first thing. A very small percentage of prophecy is predictive. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, the New Testament writers use the Old Testament in a variety of ways. And therefore, you have to kind of take every text on its own terms. For instance, we're going to talk about the birthplace of Jesus today, in Bethlehem. That you can nail down, you can footnote it, you can take it to the bank. It's as sure as shooting. In fact, the religious leaders of Herod the Butcher, who, by the way, he features in every paragraph in Matthew 2, Herod the Great. Herod. And so the only two people, by the way, that always are seeking Jesus in the Gospel of Luke is Zacchaeus and Herod. Kind of an interesting little tidbit there. But anyway, they will use them in a variety of ways. So Micah 5:2 really nails it down. Bethlehem is the place. The people could tell Herod, it's in Bethlehem. Because you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, but out of you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. No doubt about that. The virgin birth that we stack so many marbles on, and rightly so, because we think if you rob us of that, we lose part of the deity of Jesus. So rightly so, is really kind of iffy. There's not much in the Bible about the virgin birth of Christ. But boy, those have been really fighting terms. J. Gresham Machen, that taught at Princeton all those years and then helped start Westminster because he thought Princeton was going the other direction, left. He did a thesis on this idea of the virgin birth of Christ. It's not mentioned very much. And the Isaiah 7:14 passage is really kind of, it must have meant something in Isaiah's day with this prophecy about King Ahaz, and yet Matthew seems to connect the dots that, this has to do with Jesus and the Messiah. So anyway, they will use it in a variety of ways. You have to take each text on its own turn. Be careful of any what you call a cookie cutter approach, where every text has to be poured in the same mold. Which brings me to number 3, and that is the New Testament writers sometimes use the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, sometimes they use the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and sometimes they kind of paraphrased it. And I guess I want to say to you, because I believe that the Bible writers were actually preachers and teachers, isn't that what you do? Haven't you sometimes said, it says there in the Bible, and you're paraphrasing. I remember Fred Craddock used to talk about, this is back when the days when the Atlanta Falcons were like really bad. And one of the news sports commentators, as the Falcons were taking the field, said, here come the lambs to the slaughter. You'll say, were you reading Isaiah 53? No, the sports writer couldn't find Isaiah 53. Or somebody say, they can sure see the handwriting on the wall. You've been reading Daniel chapter 5? No. So, in other words, sometimes we use the scriptures kind of colloquially. Sometimes we use them just with just kind of a paraphrase. Other times we'll really nail it down. And the New Testament writers do the same thing because they were by and large preachers and teachers. So this shouldn't surprise us maybe so much. Number 4, sometimes you have to consider the literal fulfillment first and then say, okay, that doesn't seem to work. So is it typology or is it figuratively fulfilled? Number 5, this always helps us in any kind of Bible study, I think, and that is make sure that you trace the context more expansive than limited. For instance, let me just go to that very famous passage of Isaiah 7:14, which is fulfilled in Matthew 1:23, that a virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son. When Matthew uses Greek language and says parthenos, virgin, that's exactly what it means. A woman who has never, I'll use it in the biblical sense, known a man. Okay. The question is, what does the Hebrew word mean in Isaiah 7:14? The Hebrew word alma is a word for young maiden, young lady. What it literally means is someone ripe sexually. In other words, they could be married, but are they married yet? Have they engaged in sexual intercourse? So I can remember, I was born in 1953, and so later my dad was preaching when I was cutting my teeth, on the RSV version, came out in 1952. And everybody threw a tizzy fit that the RSV had gone liberal because they translate Isaiah 7:14 as a young maiden, when a young maiden will conceive. And I thought, oh, those liberals, they've thrown out the virgin birth. Chill out. No, they didn't. That's what the word means. It means young maiden. But of the 6 or 7 times that word appears in the Hebrew Bible, if you look in the context, it's pretty clear it always means virgin. There might be 1 or 2 exceptions to that. But for the most part, context makes it pretty clear that that's the case. Now, here's really my point. When you read Isaiah 7:14, a virgin will, you remember Isaiah? You got these first 5 chapters, and God says, you're my beloved, you're my vineyard, I built a hedgework around you, and yet you've sinned. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord of hosts, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. You got the great stuff in Isaiah 1-5. Isaiah chapter 6, King Uzziah died. Now what are we going to do? The king, a rather good king, King Uzziah was one of the better ones. Okay? Sometimes that's not saying much. But he was. And so it says, when the year the king Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, says Isaiah, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and the seraphim cried, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. There's this majestic scene. And Isaiah's caught up in this. And God says, who will go for us? Now, D.A. Carson has a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of a Holy God. You might remember the Jonathan Edwards sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, based on Deuteronomy. But sinners in the hands of a holy God. And usually we say, here am I, send me. Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord, and he said here. It's like he's volunteering for service, right? D.A. Carson says it may be more sheepish than that. It may be, would you use me? And maybe that's what he means. But then when Isaiah has to learn how long he has to do this, he says, get somebody else. Anyway, there's this hesitancy, it would seem, because he says you're going to have to prophesy and nobody's going to believe you. Okay, now, all of that sets the stage for chapter 7. In chapter 7, you got King Ahaz, and he's not too hot. Okay, he actually went up and he went to Damascus and saw an idol god there and brought back the drawings and had one of the guys make one, and he put it in the temple. He moved the altar burnt offering. That sets to the east of going into the Holy of Holies. Okay, so he moves that. He puts that idol there in place. He even offered one of his sons in sacrifice to pagan. So Ahaz is not that good of a guy. All right, now Isaiah comes to King Ahaz and says, listen, you don't need to worry because God is going to take care of the Assyrians. It's not going to be a problem. You just need to lean your way. You need to ask of God for him to take care of you because he's going to do it. And Ahaz, in what I would call the height of presumption, says, oh, I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't presume to test God. And that's when Isaiah says, listen, buckaroo, the Lord himself will give you a sign that a virgin will conceive, an Alma. Now, what's interesting then is you say, well, how would that relate to those people? And even Isaiah goes on after verse 14 to say, before the kid is, I'll just use it this way, before the kid is weaned, so let's just say in that culture, 2 years old, which would be about the age Jesus would have been when he escaped Egypt. Okay, before the kid is 2 years old, before he eats, certain things in his diet, God will take care of the Assyrians. Well, that's chapter 7. Chapter 8, it says this. I don't mean to be too graphic here, but you're all adults. Isaiah says, I went to the prophetess, and she conceived. Jeepers, when you go into the prophetess, Anyway, so Isaiah's wife conceives. And the question might be in the text, what did it mean? Can it mean something it never meant? So here you have the baby, this little child, and before he's 2 years old, God has taken care of the Assyrians and dealt with the judgment. And the question is that the one that was to save us? Is that the deliverer? This is what I mean by the context has to be more expansive, because you got to deal with chapter 8. And by the way, you remember the name of the kid? Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Okay, you can't even get that on the softball jersey. You know what I'm saying? Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Okay. Well, is he going to be the Messiah? But you look at chapter 8 there, you get to 9, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and he will be called a wonder of a counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. You get to chapter 11, and a shoot will come from Jesse, a Netzer, a Nazarene. Is that where that word comes from? Don't know. That might be the closest thing. But the point is, if you make the context expansive, then you realize, oh, okay, there was a baby born of a young maiden of ripe age sexually that did have a fulfillment in Ahaz's day. But the larger spread of the context shows that there's another one that will fulfill all what's involved here. Is this making sense to y'all? You spread out your contextual perimeters, and a lot of times what looks like to be kind of an odd use by the New Testament writers of an Old Testament text actually is just the opposite. It's understanding that passage in its fullest terms. I hope I'm making some sense. Anyway, the next one is this. The New Testament writers sometimes, number 6, quote or cite or allude. And that's what you do. You sometimes quote it directly. Other times you'll just kind of cite it. Other times you'll just allude to it. To make the point. And here's what Walter C. Kaiser, y'all know Walter C. Kaiser, taught at Trinity up the road in Deerfield, Illinois years ago, went out to Gordon Conwell, became their president and stuff, Old Testament scholar. Boy, you know, it would be interesting to be in his family because his brother-in-law is Bruce Waltke. Both of these guys are great Old Testament scholars. One of them thinks that you should never interpret the Old Testament by bringing in the New Testament. He says, don't borrow freight from the new to interpret the old. Let the Old Testament stand on its own and think in terms of antecedent theology, going backwards instead of going forward. That's Walter Kaiser. His brother-in-law, Bruce Waltke, says, oh, no. We have this what's called sensus plenior, the fuller meaning of the passage from the whole Bible. So use the whole Bible to interpret any given passage. Wouldn't that be a wild family reunion to attend? I mean, here's Waltke, here's Kaiser. They're going, but I kind of agree with Kaiser in this sense, and I put it down on your sheets there. When the New Testament writer is making an Old Testament text and he's using that passage to, how did I word it here? Make a point or maybe defend something, then he has understood the Old Testament passage in its richest, fullest, expanded way. Now, I hope you realize what I'm arguing for here a little bit. And that is, in other words, the prophecy might be, and with regard to Mary's pregnancy, I'm sorry for I don't mean this as a pun or play on words, but the prophecy's pregnant. It can give birth to more than one thing. It's called near far. Think of it this way, if I can illustrate the stage here. Here's Jesus, and he has said, there's coming a time in the Jerusalem temple when not one stone will be left on another. Well, that was so stunning to the apostles, it was like, well, shut my mouth. I mean, not even Peter could think of anything to say. So they're stunned. They go down the Kidron Valley, up the other side, past the Mount of Olives, past the Garden of Gethsemane, rather, up to the top of the Mount of Olives. And finally, some of them get the courage to say, Lord, that part about the not one stone on the other, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Why did the disciples connect those dots? For them, if there's no temple, there's no what? No world. Must be the end of the world. And Jesus, standing here on the Mount of Olives, thinking back to in 40 years that destruction of that city, he's looking forward to two events. 40 years in the future where Titus will come with his army and destroy Jerusalem and surround it. And then he's looking way beyond in the next, where there will be what's called the return of Christ. Technically, your New Testament never says second coming. It says Jesus will come a second time. It says that in Hebrews. But we probably ought to talk about it in terms of the return of Christ. Anyway, my point is, that's near far fulfillment. And this judgment in 70 AD with Titus and his Roman army is kind of a predictor of what's going to come later. So all of that to say, when the New Testament writers are using the Old Testament to make a point, to defend a position, to give a specific fulfillment, they have rightly understood that Old Testament text in its fullest terms. That's not to say they won't use the Old Testament in other ways, because they might. Anyway, that's too much exercise on that. I better get on or we'll never have time. I'd like to at least cover this first one. So let's talk about one of those minor prophet gospel nuggets from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. You remember Micah's name means, what is God like? And so he's got a situation where the priest and the people, they're not doing so good. And so, anyway, he says this is going to happen in Bethlehem. It's the minor prophets that tell us the birthplace of the king. So you have Micah 5:2 and Matthew 2:6 put together here. But you, O Bethlehem, Oh, Ephrathah, you are in the midst of the small one. You will be a ruler. There'll come forth from you a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So there's no question when you get to the New Testament, when Herod goes to his religious leaders and asks them where the Messiah is to be born, because he's threatened by these guys who, by the way, have retraced Abraham's steps. The journey that Abraham took to get to Israel is the exact same path that the wise men take, the Magi. And that's one of the things that Matthew's trying to show, I think, is that Jesus is the new Israel. And so they come this same way to worship him. And they stop off at Jerusalem and ask, where is he who's born King of the Jews? And Herod and they nailed it. Even though you get to John chapter 7 and you think, man, there's some confusion about where the Messiah will come from. But even then they said, no, it's Bethlehem. They knew that much. It came from Bethlehem, which is kind of interesting because Bethlehem was not a world-class city. Now, when you say certain cities, you don't even have to say what country they're in because their name carries their weight, right? So if I say New York, we don't have to say New York, New York, right? Because it carries the weight, just the city itself. If I say Tokyo, you don't have to say Japan. If I say Mexico City, you don't have to say Mexico. If I say Dubai, some cities are such world class, they just carry their weight. So it must have been stunning for Micah to say, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. Because in Jesus' day, it had a population of about 2,000 or 3,000 at best. Even today, now this is based on the 2017 census, 28,900 and what I put down here, 591 people. So it's not even a large city today. 6 miles south of Jerusalem, a little bit higher, 2,300 feet above sea level, okay? Mostly a Palestinian city in the West Bank, okay? An Arab city, at one time fairly Christian. There is another one. Did you know this? It's up north in the tribal area of Zebulun, up by the Sea of Galilee. But anyway, this is the famous one. And of course, it had a very famous well. You remember the story with David's mighty men? And he said, he longed for a drink from the well of Bethlehem. And the guys broke through enemy lines, got him the drink, brought it back. I don't know what I would have thought if I was one of those guys that broke through enemy lines. And he gets the water and he dumps it out. I think I'd have said, excuse me? We just risk our lives for you. Thank you very much. But anyway, he pours it out as an offering. You remember, David wanted to drink from the well of Bethlehem. Interesting enough, Bethlehem's only mentioned 49 times in the Bible and only 8 times in the New Testament. So what's with this? What's with this? And here's another interesting tidbit. When Joshua conquers the land in Joshua 15, there are 100 cities listed in Joshua 15 in the Judah-Ephraim area. Bethlehem is not even mentioned. And when the post-exilic man, Nehemiah, the governor, comes back and reconstitutes this area by the post-exilic people coming, Bethlehem is likewise in Nehemiah 11, not even emphasized. It's not mentioned. So why is this important? And I want to just say this, just a little bit of history stuff. It's been interesting to hear that some of you have been to Israel in more recent times, like we were. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But anyway, is this the spot? In my very first visit to Israel, years ago in the year 2000, I came away from Bethlehem a bit disappointed. I thought, man, this doesn't look like the Christmas card that I get in the mail, whoa. And so, but then in other trips, I came to appreciate what I would call the validity of the history of tradition. That there's a reason why they built the Church of the Nativity where they built it. And I had to wrestle with why is that significant? Well, let me just throw a few things by you. As to when Jesus was born, that I don't have a clue about. Some people actually will argue for December 25th. Others will say it's more like our guide, Mike Abulibda, who was born in Jerusalem on the Via Dolorosa. His mother died while giving birth to him. And so he's got Greek and Hebrew and, Arabic and English. His English is not great, but especially when he writes, you can understand him well. But Mike would tell you he thinks that Jesus was born in April or March. Okay, whatever about the time frame. But what about the place? Can you know if you go into the Church of Nativity Day and you see that little star down in the cave part beyond is that the spot? Well, a couple things for you to think about. In 135 AD, or AD 135, now that's fairly early, guys. That's just a generation or so beyond the Apostle John's death, okay? Hadrian was the Roman emperor, and he had learned that this Messiah person was born in a cave in Bethlehem. Jerome, later church scholar, would say that it also happened in a cave. So he goes and he erects a statue of Adonis. Now, Adonis was married to Aphrodite in Greek mythology. Aphrodite was the goddess of love. That's spelled L-U-S-T. Anyway, here's Aphrodite, and here's Adonis. Adonis is the husband, and so they put up, Hadrian puts up a statue in this cave on this spot in Bethlehem in AD 135. See, back in the day, if your country conquered my country, you would put up your idols and gods because my God's better than your. See, that's how this worked. And that's why mosques and church buildings kind of switched hands through the years. Go to Istanbul and you'll see that. Anyway, so that's AD 135. By 325, things have really changed. If you're a good church historian, you know, oh, that's the Council of Nicaea. But think again, because this is a guy by the name of Constantine who's persecuting Christians, but then he has this vision, and whatever you want to do with it, I do not know, that in this name conquer, and there's a symbol of a cross. He knew that that's what the Christians talked about. So he does a 180. His mother was Helena, was actually a believer. That probably didn't hurt him either when Mama says, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, he turns around, becomes a Christian, pays his soldiers to get baptized, gives them all a change of clothing, and he goes down to Bethlehem, Helena goes to Bethlehem, and in 325, AD 325, she erects the first of what might be called a church building over this very spot where Adonis was. Now, what I'm saying to you, you don't have to believe this, you don't want to. You say, well, it still doesn't look like my Christmas card. Okay, whatever. But AD 135, AD 325, I think the Church of the Nativity in Nativity Square in Bethlehem, if that's not the spot, it's pretty close. That fair enough? Pretty close. So in other words, what I'm arguing for here is the fact that our Bible is not once upon a time. These things really happened in time and space. The Bible is, in those days, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Nothing more real than that, huh? Taxes? So, anyway, I think we can know that this is, in fact, the spot. But for us, it's not the spot, is it? It's the Savior. It's not the spot, it's the Savior. So let me move to that. What does this seemingly insignificant city mean? If you put the minor prophets with the New Testament fulfillment, you get this. Bethlehem gives us a royal king. I think that's my first stopping off place, a royal king. Now to get this, I want to go back to the book of Ruth. As I mentioned earlier, it starts out in the days of the judges, where every man does that which is right in his own eyes. There's no king in Israel. In those days, there was a famine in the land. So Elimelech, interesting name, don't you think? Elimelech, El, God, my, Melech, king, my God is king. Pretty good name. Is married to Naomi. They have 2 boys. There's a famine in the land, which is ironic in light of what Bethlehem means. We'll get to that later. But anyway, they go down into Moab. Now that's interesting because Moab started with an incestuous relationship. And Moab was not, up to the 10th generation, you can't have those guys serving in the temple. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. But they go down to Moab to feed their family. Can't blame them for trying to feed their family, I guess. During that time, the boys marry people, 2 girls there, each of them, and then all the menfolk died. So you know the story. The word on the street is there's bread back in the house of bread, Bethlehem. So Naomi goes back. Ruth, they go with her, and she says, even if I was to have a child tonight, you wouldn't, so you go back. And Ruth doesn't. She sticks like glue. And she says, no, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. It's a beautiful passage, okay? Loyalty of the daughter-in-law. Well, they get back there. Of course, Ruth is feeling obligated to take care of Naomi, and so she goes to glean in the field. You remember the Old Testament law about leaving some trimmings around the edges for the poor. So she gleans. When she gets home, Naomi says, well, what field did you go in? Well, I think his name was Boaz. And Naomi blows a gasket. Boaz? Did you say Boaz? Oh, my dear. He is a Goel, a kinsman redeemer. Now, in the narrative, up to 2:14 in Ruth, that word has not appeared yet. But from 2:14 to the end of the book, in chapter 4, it's a short book, that word will appear, I think, 14 times. Kinsman redeemer, kinsman redeemer, kinsman redeemer. And you know the storyline. So based on, if I could just be this plain spoken, Naomi is kind of brash in pushing Ruth to go to Boaz at the gleaning, the threshing floor. And then Ruth is, boy, how do I say this nicely? Rather forward in her marriage proposal by uncovering his legs. And this seems really weird to us, some of these customs and things. And yet she puts herself forward, and Boaz then has to realize that he's not the closest, for her proposal, he's not the closest relative. You know who is? Cousin Eddie. You remember Cousin Eddie? Yeah, that's who's so we got to deal with Cousin Eddie. So when Cousin Eddie says, yeah, I want that land. Okay, you got to take Ruth. Oh, now I'm jeopardizing my boys. No, you can have her. And the story ends that they have a child, Ruth and Boaz, named Obed, and Obed has a child named Jesse, and Jesse has a kid named David. There's a lot going on in that book, but you slide out of Ruth and into 1 Samuel, and you have Saul, the first king of Israel, who goes belly up, as we mentioned, chapter 13, chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. So Samuel, this bridge guy between the days of the judges and the days of the kings, this prophet, he has to get his vial of oil and go to Bethlehem and anoint one of the sons of Jesse to be the king, because unlike Saul, he has a heart after God. Now, where am I driving all this? You've got to unpack Ruth. You've got to unpack. See, the Bible comes to us in layers. It's like a good layered salad or a good layered dessert. Just layers to this thing. And that's why Kreiser always wants us to think of antecedent theology, going backwards as opposed to always going forward. What has already come before us? And so what you're realizing is this: when this king comes, but you, O Bethlehem. Everybody said, Bethel, what? Bethlehem. Ephrathah. Out of you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And so they knew where this royal king was. And sometimes for application purposes, we need to remember who we are. Caleb, is talking to us about identity. And I would just tell you, in our present culture, if you don't secure your identity in Jesus Christ, you are going to be a mess. Because of where we've separated gender from sexuality. It's just weird what's happened here. Don't know what bathroom to use and can't determine what sport you should play. But so identity becomes a thing. And that's what was brilliant about C.S. Lewis. When he writes the first of those 7 volumes in Chronicles, children's books that adults can almost understand. And he tells us about the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe. Edmund sells his soul to the witch for Turkish delight, the little creep. So the only way to get him back is that the lion has to die, right? But once that Edmund is forgiven, and once that Peter and Edmund and Susan and Lucy, they sit on the thrones and they reign. Because they are connected to the great lion Aslan. In other words, they have royal blood running through their veins. That's what Bethlehem says. Bethlehem says we have a royal king. But Bethlehem not only says that, it says also we have a tender shepherd. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. Out of you will come forth a shepherd, which is kind of interesting. The word ruler here is not the normal word for king, melech. It's a different word. And this word means probably something similar: leader, commander, procurator, like Pilate was down in Jerusalem later on. The main metaphor for leadership in the Bible, I know we got a lot of leaders in the audience here. Main metaphor for leadership in the Bible is that of shepherd. I love Isaiah 40, verse 11. It's so different, Isaiah 40 to 66, than the first 39 chapters. Some people think there's 2 authors. Well, I don't know what to do with that. But it says in verse 11, he will gather his children in his arms like lambs. He is a shepherd. Now, what needs to come back to us in this regard, again, the Bible comes to us in layers, is Genesis 29. I was just reading this. Caleb mentioned about the NLT. I've been reading this year for my devotions as it started in 24 with the New English version. And so I'm reading that one this time around, the New English translation, NET. But anyway, I was reading Genesis 29 just this morning at the hotel. And that's this incredible story to me, because here's Jacob. I don't even like Jacob. Do you like Jacob? I don't like him. He's smooth-skinned. I like Esau. He's a hairy man, But Jacob's just kind of mama's boy. And anyway, he's not very athletic, I don't think. And so, which my wife says that's my problem. Anyway, so the deception. Of course, his name means heel grabber. That's a problem. But anyway, he deceives his brother out of these 2 things, and he has to run away. And anyway, he gets up there and he goes to work for Laban so that he can have Rachel. Okay? He works 7 years and gets the wrong girl. He's upset. I think he has a point, you know? But anyway, I mean, he walks up and it's Leah. Behold, it's Leah. I just think, wouldn't you know? Wouldn't you know? Must have been a thick veil. That's all I got to say. Anyway, so it's a strange kind of thing. He's up there for all these many years. He has these 4 wives. He's got all these kids, these boys and a girl. And they come back, and of course, they're going to have an encounter with his brother Esau. He's coming with 400 men. This doesn't look good. And we just don't know what made this almost seems to line up with the parable of Jesus and the lost boys in Luke 15. I don't know how to, but somehow time did a number on Esau, and they embrace, and all is well, and you know the story. But Rachel is pregnant, and they get down to Ramah, they get down to Bethlehem area, and she dies giving birth to Benjamin. By the way, when Jacob goes up there to find her, she is a what? She is a shepherdess. She was coming to give the sheep water. So again, you begin to see, wow, here's a shepherd. She dies near Bethlehem. Does a shepherd have to die near Bethlehem to make things? You start putting these things together. I don't know how many fans of The Chosen we have in the audience. And I get people all the time asking me, do you like this? It's not biblical. I think, shut up. Anyway, I know. But the question is, are they capturing, Dallas Jenkins, bless his heart, his dad Jerry would be in a different place, as far as the eschatology goes than me. But that's all right. But anyway, I like it. And it's interesting, we're into season 3 kind of watching. We've shown stuff at the church. But anyway, there's this, when Jesus is going through the crowds in Capernaum, and the woman whose name in church history is Veronica. The Bible never tells us her name. She's pushing through the crowd because she has this hemorrhaging for 12 years. She's known in Life of Christ studies as the woman with the flow of blood. How would you like that as your label? So she just has realized that this teacher can perform miracles, and she works her way through the crowd and touches just the tassels from his garment and immediately feels she's well. Jesus stops. Wait, stop. Everybody stopped. Someone touched me. Peter comes up. Master, everybody's touching you. No, somebody touched me. I know that power went out from me. He turns around. Whoever touched me, please come forward. Jesus looks down, and there's this woman. And he looks at her. And she says, I touched you, but it was just the hem of your garment. I promise you, it won't be unclean. And Jesus looks down at her, and he says, daughter. I'm no one's daughter. He looks down and says, daughter, you have blessed me today. He says, I wish I had more time to talk with you. But I must go with this man here, that's Jairus, because he has a faith like yours. I did some research on the lady that plays that role. Her name is, did I put that on the sheet? Yeah, I guess I did. I think you say it, Zéla Vousso. Zéla Vousso. And she is the lady that plays this. She's 30 years old. She went to acting school. Her father is Iranian. Her mother is, or maybe I got this backwards, Native American. Now that's a weird combo, Wow, you talk about a biracial system. Anyway, so she has 3 degrees, one in acting, one in business, I think in business, and the other one is in law. She practices law in California as a hobby. I don't even know if she's a Christian, but she's 30 years old. And I just pray that Catholic guy playing Jesus, who looks down at her and says, daughter, that, my friends, is a tender shepherd. A ruler who shepherds. One more thing, and then we got to have lunch. And that's this. Bethlehem gives us an abundant provider. What does Bethlehem mean? House of bread. What does Ephrathah mean? Fruitful. Rather ironic in light of where it all starts back in the book of Ruth. And I put down here Judges 17 to 21, which are some of the ugliest chapters in the Bible. And I won't even go into all of that right now, but bread was scarce. Even in John 6, Jesus says, to them. The bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven, gives life to the world. I am the bread of life. He who eats my flesh, drinks my... Now imagine how that would sound to a Hebrew person. Eating the flesh, drinking the blood. Are you serious? You must consume me, says the master. Bread. We did this at our church in Denver before coming back to the college to teach. I was at church there. And one morning, just to kind of get this, multi-sensory preaching thing going, we had brought in convection ovens around the auditorium. And we're baking bread as people came in. It was like, is this Subway? Is this Jimmy John's? What's going on here? The smell of bread is just awesome. And it just reminds us of how he can provide for our needs. 14 states of the 50 United States of America have Bethlehems. I don't know if Illinois does. I texted, is there a Bethlehem, Illinois? There is a Bethlehem, Missouri. It has about 500. But did you know Joplin, Missouri is a sister city of Bethlehem, Israel? The dude who was the mayor of Bethlehem was a Catholic guy, and he actually came to Joplin. And Joplin, Missouri, of all places in the world, is a sister city to Bethlehem, Israel. They gave him the key to the city, which if I was him, I wouldn't take it because you might get blown away by a tornado. But anyway, you know what I'm saying? It's just like, wow. So what is all this about? Jesus, the Old Testament prediction and the New Testament fulfillment is basically this, that he is our royal king. So we get to have royal blood flowing through our veins. He is this tender shepherd who treats me with incredible kindness and chesed, loving kindness. And he is this abundant provider. There's at least that application in this.